Millionaire hires secretary, then learns she's raising his abandoned child. Richard Kensington sat at the large mahogany desk in his office, the city of New York sprawling beneath the windows behind him. The skyline, with its sparkling lights and towering skyscrapers, felt as distant to him as the personal life he had long since abandoned. His life revolved around his business empire, and he wore that like a badge of honor. At 45, Richard had everything a man could want: wealth, success, power, but he knew the emptiness that came with it. He hadn't had much of a personal life since the death of his wife 5 years ago. Her passing had left him with a void that no amount of money or work could fill. He had poured himself into his work, isolating himself from the world outside his office walls. The one thing that kept him going was the firm belief that he had everything under control. Today was no different. His mind raced with numbers and strategies, looking at projections for the next quarter and analyzing investments. The world was at his fingertips, until the door to his office opened, and in walked his new secretary. Emily Williams was in her late 20s, wearing a professional yet understated outfit, simple gray slacks and a white blouse. Her hair was neatly pulled back into a ponytail, and her gentle demeanor immediately stood out against the backdrop of Richard's high-powered world. He had just hired her a week ago, and so far, she had exceeded his expectations. The papers on his desk had been sorted, the appointment scheduled without error, and the phone calls dealt with swiftly. "Good morning, Mr. Kensington," she said in her soft, polite voice, stepping forward with a small stack of papers. Richard looked up from his laptop, surprised by the sound of her voice, though it was calm and professional as always. "Morning, Emily. What do we have for today?" She glanced at the papers in her hand and offered a slight smile. "A couple of meetings scheduled for later, but first, there's a report from the marketing team regarding the new campaign. They're requesting your feedback." Richard nodded, gesturing to the chair in front of his desk. "Perfect. Have a seat and we'll go over it together." As Emily sat down, Richard couldn't help but notice how well she had adapted to the job. She was diligent, organized, and had a calm presence that made the busy environment of his office seem less overwhelming. He had quickly come to rely on her efficiency, but there was something else, a quiet strength in her eyes, an air of mystery he hadn't quite figured out yet. But he wasn't the type to pry into his employees' lives. They spent the next few hours working together, reviewing reports and discussing strategy. For the first time in a long while, Richard found himself appreciating the interaction. He was used to being in charge, to giving orders, and he had always preferred working alone. But Emily's competence and quiet professionalism made him reconsider his approach. Maybe having a reliable assistant wasn't such a bad thing after all. As the afternoon passed, Richard's mind wandered, briefly, but enough to notice the clock ticking down. His usual routine would have him working late into the night, but something about today felt different. Emily had a way of making the office feel less like a battleground and more like a place of collaboration. He didn't realize it until now, but he had been looking forward to these moments. She wasn't just an assistant. She had a way of making everything run smoother without needing to be noticed. Suddenly, his phone buzzed on the desk. Richard picked it up, glancing at the screen. "Mr. Kensington, I need you to sign off on these documents by the end of the day," his CFO's message read. Richard was about to respond when he noticed Emily standing by the door, preparing to leave for the evening. "I'll see you tomorrow," she said, her voice still kind but polite, betraying no hint of emotion or fatigue. It was clear she kept a professional distance. "Of course," Richard replied, feeling a strange sense of reluctance. "Thank you for your hard work today, Emily." She gave him a polite nod. "It's my pleasure, Mr. Kensington." As she stepped out of the office, Richard found himself staring at the door for a moment longer than usual. He shrugged it off, focusing back on the text message from his CFO. But something about Emily's presence lingered in the air, a sense of quiet intrigue he hadn't expected. Weeks passed, and Emily continued to impress Richard with her efficiency and ability to handle the demands of his business without ever flinching. He started to rely on her more and more, enjoying their working relationship but still unaware of the deeper connection that was about to unfold. In many ways, their bond was growing stronger, but he still kept his distance, not allowing himself to entertain the idea of anything personal. One late afternoon, after another long day of work, Richard left his office, deciding to clear his mind with a walk. He strolled down the sidewalk, his mind racing through business plans and the upcoming quarterly review. As he passed a nearby park, his attention was drawn to a small figure sitting on a bench near the fountain. At first, he didn't think much of it, but then, the little boy turned toward him, and Richard felt his heart skip a beat. The boy couldn't have been older than 5, with a mop of dark hair and bright, inquisitive eyes. Richard stopped, a strange pull drawing him toward the bench. The boy's gaze lingered on him for a moment before he slowly stood up and ran toward him, calling out in excitement. "Hi, mister," the boy shouted, his voice innocent and carefree. Richard was taken aback but managed to smile, bending down to meet the child's gaze. "Hey there, little guy," he said, a chuckle escaping his lips. "Are you lost?" The boy shook his head, but there was something oddly familiar about his features. His dark eyes, his smile. It struck Richard like a wave, and for a moment he wondered if he had met the boy somewhere before. But that didn't make sense. He had no children, no family. Or so he thought. Just then, a woman approached, her hurried footsteps interrupting his thoughts. She stopped beside the boy, her eyes widening in surprise when she saw Richard. "Ben," she called softly, but with an edge of concern. "I told you to wait for me." The boy turned, seemingly unbothered, and took her hand. Richard's eyes remained fixed on them, a strange feeling in his chest. The woman was Emily, his secretary, his reliable assistant. Before Richard could process the significance of the moment, Emily looked up and froze when she saw him standing there, an almost invisible tension in the air between them. For a brief moment, the world seemed to slow down, and Richard saw it. The resemblance between himself and the boy, the unmistakable signs that made his heart race. "Emily," Richard said, his voice a mix of confusion and realization. "Is this your son?" Emily's face went pale as she took a step back, her eyes widening in shock. "Mr. Kensington," she stammered, then paused, swallowing hard. I didn't think you'd ever find out." Richard was speechless for a moment, his mind scrambling to process the bombshell that had just been dropped. He had a son. A child he never knew existed. And that child was right in front of him. The silence between Richard and Emily hung in the air like a thick fog. The child, Ben, stood between them, oblivious to the heavy weight of the moment. His bright eyes flickered between Richard and his mother, sensing the tension but not fully understanding it. Richard took a step back, his mind still racing. This wasn't possible, was it? He had always thought his life was neatly packaged. Everything had its place. His business, his home, his routine. And now, out of nowhere, Emily had dropped a bombshell that shattered everything he thought he knew about his own past. Is Ben my son?" Richard asked again, his voice much quieter this time, as if testing the words on his tongue. Emily's face flushed, and she hesitated before nodding. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Ben is your son. I've been raising him alone for the past 5 years." Richard's mind spun, and for a brief moment, he felt as though the ground beneath him had shifted. His heart beat faster, his thoughts fragmented as he tried to comprehend the situation. "How?" Richard finally managed to ask. "How could I not know? Why didn't you tell me?" Emily looked down at the ground, avoiding his gaze. She exhaled deeply, trying to gather her thoughts before speaking. "I never intended to keep this from you," she said softly. "But when I found out I was pregnant, everything happened so fast. You were a stranger to me then, someone I barely knew. I wasn't in a position to ask for help, and I didn't want to burden you with something you didn't want." Richard felt his chest tighten, a mixture of guilt and confusion gnawing at him. "I didn't want to help?" he asked incredulously. "How could you think that?" "I would've." "Richard, you were at a point in your life where you didn't seem to want a family," Emily interrupted, her voice trembling with the weight of her own regrets. "You were so focused on your career. I didn't want to force anything on you. But I had a right to know." Richard's voice rose, the anger inside him bubbling to the surface. "I should have known about my own son. This isn't just about you, Emily. This is my life, my responsibility." The harshness in his words stung, and Emily winced, her eyes welling up with tears. She hadn't expected him to react this way, but perhaps she should have. She had never imagined that the moment she would reveal the truth would be so difficult, so painful. She had hoped that, in time, Richard would come to understand why she had kept this secret. Ben tugged at Emily's sleeve, looking up at her with concern. "Mom, what's wrong?" he asked innocently, his voice small and soft. Richard's heart softened at the sight of the little boy's confusion. Despite the anger and frustration, he couldn't ignore the fact that Ben was his son. His blood. The child he had never known existed. Emily crouched down to Ben's level, gently brushing her hand over his hair. "It's okay, sweetheart," she said quietly. "We're just talking, okay?" Ben nodded, but he didn't seem entirely convinced. He turned back to Richard, his eyes wide and curious. "Are you my daddy?" he asked, his voice small but full of hope. Richard's throat tightened, and for a moment he couldn't speak. He had never expected his life to take such an unexpected turn. How could he answer a question like that? Was he ready to be a father? Was he ready to take on the responsibility of raising a child? He looked at Emily, then back at Ben, and in that instant he realized that he couldn't just walk away. He had a son now, whether he was ready or not. "I don't know," Richard said finally, his voice shaky. "But I'm going to try, Ben. I'm going to try to be the best father I can be." Emily gave him a small, tentative smile, though her eyes were still filled with tears. "You don't have to try alone," she said softly. "I've been doing this on my own for so long, but I didn't want to raise him without knowing who you are. I wanted you to have a chance to know him, too." Richard nodded, swallowing hard. His mind was still spinning, but he knew this was just the beginning. There were so many questions, so many emotions swirling within him. But he also knew that he couldn't just ignore this. Ben was his son, and no matter how complicated everything felt, he had a responsibility to this little boy. "I'm sorry," Richard said, his voice low. "I'm sorry for everything, for not being there sooner. I don't know what happened or why it took me this long to understand. But I'm here now." Emily reached out, placing her hand gently on his arm. "I didn't want to keep this from you," she said quietly. "I wanted to tell you, but I didn't know how. I didn't want you to think I was trying to trap you or make you feel guilty. I just wanted Ben to have a chance at knowing his father." Richard let out a long sigh, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know what the future holds. But I can't change the past. What matters now is how we move forward, together." For the first time in the conversation, Emily smiled, her shoulders relaxing. "Thank you," she said softly. "That's all I've ever wanted." The three of them stood there for a few moments, the air thick with unspoken emotions. Richard could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, but he also felt a strange sense of relief. It was a relief that he had finally confronted the truth, that he had finally acknowledged Ben as his son. Richard looked down at the boy, who was still holding Emily's hand. Ben's innocent gaze seemed to be searching for something in Richard, something he hadn't yet given. And that realization hit Richard harder than anything else. "I'm going to be here for you, Ben," Richard said, kneeling down to the boy's level. "I promise." Ben's eyes lit up with a smile that melted Richard's heart. "Really?" he asked, his voice filled with wonder. "Really," Richard replied, his voice thick with emotion. From that moment on, Richard's world would never be the same. The busy, cold executive who had once been consumed by ambition and isolation was now faced with the most important role he could ever play. And though he had a long way to go, he was determined to be the father Ben needed. Richard spent the next few days in a haze, unable to focus on much other than the events that had unfolded in the park. The revelation that he had a son, a child he had never known about, shook him to his core. His mind couldn't stop running in circles, analyzing every angle of the situation, trying to make sense of how it had happened. Emily had kept this secret for so long, and now he was left to pick up the pieces of a life he had never even known existed. But he couldn't ignore the fact that Ben, the little boy with the wide eyes and hopeful smile, was now part of his world. And somehow, Richard knew that he couldn't just walk away from this. He had a responsibility, one that he hadn't signed up for, but one that was undeniable. After spending an uncomfortable night of restless sleep, Richard decided to take action. He called his assistant first thing in the morning, asking her to clear his schedule for the rest of the day. He couldn't afford to put this off any longer. If he was going to be a father, he needed to start learning how. He knew he couldn't do this alone. As much as he liked to be in control, this was different. This was about a life he had created, and it was time to face the reality of it. By the time he reached Emily's apartment later that afternoon, Richard had tried to calm his nerves, but his heart was still pounding in his chest. He couldn't help it. This wasn't something he could just walk into and expect everything to fall into place. The truth was, he had no idea what he was doing. Emily opened the door after his third knock, her face looking pale and tired. She must have been waiting for him, and when she saw him standing there, her expression softened, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "Richard," she trailed off, clearly unsure of how to proceed. "I wasn't expecting you so soon." "I know. I wasn't sure how to do this either." Richard hesitated, glancing past her to see if Ben was nearby. The last thing he wanted to do was make this situation more awkward, but he was already in the thick of it. "I wanted to talk. About Ben. About everything." Emily stepped aside, allowing him to enter. "Come in," she said quietly, her voice soft but carrying a weight he couldn't ignore. The apartment was cozy, far more humble than Richard's own luxurious penthouse. The walls were lined with framed photographs of a smiling young boy, Ben, growing up in what Richard realized had been a single-parent household. The photos depicted Ben's milestones, his birthday parties, vacations, and family moments that were missing one key figure, Richard. As Richard followed Emily into the small living room, he felt a pang of guilt wash over him. How could he have missed this? How could he have lived his life without ever knowing that he had a son out there, growing up without him? Ben was sitting on the floor, drawing something on a piece of paper. When he noticed Richard, he looked up, his eyes full of curiosity and hope. He smiled tentatively but didn't say anything. Emily had told him about Richard's visit, but the little boy still seemed uncertain, unsure of how to react to this new person in his life. "Hi, Ben," Richard said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "I hope I'm not interrupting your drawing." Ben nodded shyly, holding up the paper for Richard to see. "I drew a picture of us," he said, his voice quiet but proud. Richard leaned down, looking at the drawing. It was simple, a stick figure version of a man and a boy, both smiling. The figure of the man was clearly based on Richard, and for a moment he felt his heart ache. Ben had drawn him, the father he never knew. "That's a great picture, Ben," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. He reached out tentatively and placed his hand on the boy's shoulder. Ben didn't pull away, and for a brief moment, Richard felt like he was taking the first step towards something meaningful. Emily watched the exchange quietly, standing a few feet away. Her eyes flickered between Richard and Ben, unsure of how much to say or how much to push him. The dynamic between them was delicate, fragile, and she was aware that it could easily tip in one direction or the other. After a long pause, Richard stood up and faced Emily. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "I didn't know about Ben, and I didn't know what I was missing. I need to learn how to be his father. I've never done anything like this before." Emily's face softened, and she stepped closer to him. "You don't have to figure everything out in one day, Richard," she said. "We've both been doing this on our own for so long. It'll take time. But if you want to be part of Ben's life, we can figure it out together. I won't ask for more than you can give." Richard met her gaze, feeling the weight of her words settle deep inside him. She had raised Ben on her own for 5 years, and now, the responsibility was being thrust upon him, whether he was ready or not. He could feel the enormity of it all, the fear and excitement warring within him. "I want to be here," Richard said, his voice firm but vulnerable. "For Ben. For you. I don't know where to start." Emily's eyes filled with understanding. "You start by showing up," she said softly. "And from there, we take it one day at a time." Ben stood up and walked over to Richard, holding out the piece of paper he had drawn. "Can you keep it?" he asked. "So you'll remember me?" Richard took the paper, his fingers trembling slightly. "I'll keep it, Ben. I'll keep it always," he promised, his voice thick with emotion. The weight of the promise settled in his chest, but this time, he didn't shy away from it. Emily watched the exchange between the two of them, feeling a bittersweet sense of relief. She had spent so long trying to protect Ben from the uncertainty of never knowing his father, but now, it seemed like Richard was finally stepping up. This wasn't going to be easy, but it was a step in the right direction. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Richard stayed for dinner, hesitant but trying to engage with Ben. The awkwardness was palpable, but Richard did his best to connect with the child, asking him about his favorite cartoons, games, and things he liked to do. Ben was shy at first, but as the evening wore on, he warmed up to Richard, a tentative bond beginning to form. At the end of the night, Richard stood by the door, ready to leave but hesitant to say goodbye. "I'll see you tomorrow, Ben," Richard said softly. "And I'll bring you something, a toy, maybe?" Richard knelt down to Ben's level, placing a hand on his shoulder. "That's awesome, Ben. You're really getting good at this." Ben's smile widened. "Do you want to try with me?" he asked, his eyes sparkling with hope. Richard hesitated for a moment, looking at Emily for confirmation. She smiled warmly, nodding. "Go ahead," she said softly. "He's been waiting for you." With that, Richard stood up and walked over to the swing, pushing Ben gently once more, this time with a newfound sense of purpose. He pushed higher this time, feeling the wind whip through his hair as he sent Ben soaring into the air, the child's laughter ringing in his ears. For the first time in a long time, Richard felt like he was doing something right. He had a son, a family, an uncharted territory that was both exhilarating and terrifying. But as he watched Ben laugh and call out for him to push higher, he realized that this was exactly where he needed to be. And no matter how difficult it might be, no matter how many challenges they would face, Richard was determined to be the father Ben needed. As the evening wore on, Richard, Emily, and Ben sat on the grass, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The world felt a little bit smaller, a little bit kinder. The tension that had once been between him and Emily began to dissipate as they spent this quiet time together. "I don't know what comes next," Richard said quietly, his voice filled with uncertainty. "But I'm ready to figure it out." Emily looked at him, her expression tender but full of resolve. "We'll figure it out together," she said, her voice steady. "One step at a time." And for the first time since the revelation, Richard believed her. He was ready to face the future, to be the man, the father, and the partner that they both deserved. The days that followed were a whirlwind of adjustments, small victories, and moments of doubt. Richard had always been a man of control, accustomed to running his empire with precision and order. But now, he was learning that fatherhood didn't come with a manual. There were no clear instructions for how to be a good parent, especially when the relationship with your child had started so unexpectedly. Emily had been a constant presence, offering gentle guidance and support as Richard navigated his new role. She had raised Ben on her own for so long that it was second nature for her to care for him. But now, with Richard involved, the dynamic between them was shifting. She had always done things her way, protecting Ben from the uncertainty of a life without a father, and now, she had to figure out how to allow Richard to take his place in Ben's life without feeling like she was giving up control. Richard knew he had to earn their trust. He couldn't simply waltz into their lives and expect everything to fall into place. It would take time, patience, effort, and a willingness to be vulnerable. But despite the uncertainty, there were moments of joy that made him realize just how much he wanted to be there for Ben. These small moments, a laugh, a hug, a shared look, made him feel like he was finally part of something real. One Saturday afternoon, Richard found himself sitting at a small cafe near Emily's apartment. He had taken the morning off from work, something he hadn't done in years, to spend more time with Ben. Emily had suggested they go to the cafe for a change of pace, and Richard, feeling the weight of his new responsibilities, agreed. Ben was already at the table, coloring in a book with bright crayons. His small hands were busy, and his tongue poked out in concentration as he filled the page with vibrant colors. Richard sat down beside him, watching for a moment before speaking. "Hey, buddy," he said softly. "What are you working on?" Ben looked up, his face lighting up when he saw Richard. "It's a picture of dinosaurs," he said, excitedly showing Richard the page. "Do you like it?" Richard studied the drawing for a moment. It was a simple scene with green and brown dinosaurs roaming through a bright blue sky, but the detail in Ben's eyes spoke volumes. "It's amazing, Ben. You're really good at this." Ben beamed with pride, and Richard felt a warmth in his chest. The boy was so eager to share his world with him, and for the first time in his life, Richard realized how much he had been missing. The innocence, the joy, the simple pleasure of spending time together, it was all new to him, and it felt like something he never wanted to let go of. Emily walked over with a tray of drinks, her smile soft but tired. She had been working hard to adjust to the new rhythm of their life, balancing her responsibilities at work with her role as a mother. She set the drinks down on the table, glancing at Richard before sitting beside him. "Everything okay?" she asked, her eyes flickering between him and Ben. "You guys having fun?" "We are," Richard said, his voice warm. "Ben's been teaching me all about dinosaurs. I'm learning a lot." Ben looked up, his eyes full of mischief. "I'm gonna be a dinosaur expert when I grow up," he said confidently. "I'll teach you everything, Daddy." Richard smiled at the title, the words still unfamiliar on his tongue. "You're gonna be an expert for sure," he said. "Maybe you can teach me a thing or two." Emily watched the exchange, her heart swelling with an emotion she couldn't quite put into words. It wasn't perfect, not yet, but it was a start. Richard was trying. And for that, she was grateful. She had never imagined that her life would take this turn, that the man she had worked for all these years would become a part of her and Ben's world in this way. But here they were, slowly building something together. The conversation turned to casual matters, what Ben was learning at school, the latest projects Richard was working on, but beneath it all, there was an unspoken understanding between the three of them. They were becoming a family, piece by piece, and although the road ahead would be filled with challenges, there was a quiet sense of peace in knowing they were in this together. The next week, Richard found himself sitting in the same cafe, this time alone. Emily had called to tell him that she had a work meeting, and Ben was at a playdate with one of his friends. As he sipped his coffee, Richard allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. The silence felt different now. It wasn't lonely, but it wasn't the peace he used to know either. There was something else now, a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life for years. His phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him out of his thoughts. He pulled it out and saw that it was a text from Emily. "I need to talk. Can you come by tonight after work?" Richard's heart skipped a beat. He knew that tone, calm, but with an undercurrent of urgency. His first instinct was to worry, but he pushed the feeling aside. Whatever it was, they could handle it. He quickly typed a response. "Of course. I'll be there." That evening, after a long day of work, Richard arrived at Emily's apartment. The door was slightly ajar, and he knocked softly before stepping inside. Emily was sitting on the couch, her hands folded in her lap. Ben was playing in the other room, his laughter echoing through the apartment. "Hey," Richard said gently, closing the door behind him. Emily looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "Hi," she replied quietly. Richard sat down beside her, unsure of what to expect. "What's going on? Is everything okay?" Emily hesitated, taking a deep breath before speaking. "I've been thinking a lot, Richard. About Ben. About us." Richard's heart began to race. "What do you mean?" She looked at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "I know you're trying and I appreciate that. But I need to be honest with you. I've been raising Ben alone for so long. I've built this life for him. I don't know how to do it any other way. I don't know how to share this responsibility, even though I want to. But I also know Ben needs both of us. I just don't know if I'm ready to fully trust that you'll be here for the long haul." Richard felt a sharp pang in his chest. He knew this wasn't easy for Emily. She had been doing this alone for so long, and now everything was changing. "I understand," he said softly. "And I don't want to rush anything. I'm not here to force my way into your lives. I just want to be here for both of you. I'm not going anywhere." Emily looked at him for a long moment, her eyes filled with conflict. "I want to believe you," she said quietly. "But I need more time. I need to see if this is real. If you're really going to be here, not just for Ben, but for me too." Richard nodded, his voice sincere. "I understand. I'll be patient. I'm not going anywhere, Emily." For the first time, Emily allowed herself to let go of some of the tension that had been holding her back. She leaned into him, a small, tentative gesture, but it meant everything. Richard wrapped his arm around her, feeling the warmth of the moment, the quiet trust that was beginning to form between them. "I'm here," he whispered, "and I'm not going anywhere." As they sat there, the soft sound of Ben's laughter in the background, Richard realized that he wasn't just becoming a father. He was learning how to be part of something bigger than himself. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about them, about building a future together. And no matter how difficult it might be, Richard knew that this was where he belonged. The weeks that followed were filled with a mixture of progress and setbacks, each day bringing Richard closer to the realization that family wasn't something that could be built in a boardroom. It took patience, vulnerability, and, most of all, trust. He had spent most of his life controlling everything around him, but now he had to learn to let go of that control and allow space for others to become a part of his world. Despite his best efforts, there were moments when Richard found himself struggling. As the CEO of a successful tech company, his days were packed with meetings, financial reports, and decisions that affected hundreds of employees. But now, he had Ben and Emily to consider. The balance between his career and his new role as a father and a partner felt like walking a tightrope. He was terrified of slipping, of losing everything he had worked for in his career. But at the same time, he couldn't ignore the pull to be present in Ben's life, to be there for Emily in a way he never had before. It was a typical Tuesday morning when Richard realized just how much he was beginning to change. He had arrived early at the office, the sun barely rising over the horizon. His assistant had already left for the day, and the office was quiet, the hum of the computers the only sound in the vast space. Richard was lost in a pile of paperwork when his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, expecting another work-related text, but instead, it was from Emily. "Ben is having a rough day. He's asking for you." Richard's heart tightened at the message. Ben was only 6 years old, and though Richard had only been in his life for a short time, he had come to realize just how sensitive and perceptive the child was. Richard had been present for Ben's laughter, his triumphs, and even some of the quieter moments. But he had never been there for him when he was upset. Emily had always been the one to pick up the pieces when Ben was hurting. Now, Richard realized that it was his turn to step up. He quickly grabbed his jacket and made his way out of the office. The streets of the city were still bustling with early morning commuters, and the sun had just begun to rise, casting long shadows across the pavement. He hadn't realized how much he'd become accustomed to the relentless pace of work until now, how easy it had been to bury himself in his career. But now, with Emily's message, he knew that there was something more important than deadlines and profits. There was family. Richard arrived at Emily's apartment in record time, his mind racing with thoughts of Ben. He had no idea what the issue was, but he was determined to be there for his son. As he knocked on the door, his pulse quickened. Emily opened it a moment later, her expression somber, though she forced a smile when she saw him. "Richard," she said softly. "Thank you for coming." He stepped inside, glancing around for Ben. The little boy was sitting on the couch, his legs pulled up to his chest, his eyes red-rimmed from crying. His favorite blanket was draped across his lap, but his gaze was distant, lost in his own thoughts. Richard approached him slowly, kneeling down in front of the couch. "Hey, buddy," he said gently, keeping his voice calm and soothing. "What's going on?" Ben sniffled, wiping his eyes with the sleeve of his shirt. "I miss my mom," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want her to come back." Richard's heart clenched. He hadn't anticipated this. Ben had lost his mother when he was just a baby, but the pain of that loss had been buried, tucked away beneath the surface of his young mind. Now, as Ben grew older, the reality of the absence he felt seemed to be catching up with him. Richard sat down beside him, his heart aching for the boy. "I understand," he said softly, placing a hand on Ben's shoulder. "I know it's hard not having her around. But you know, Ben, I'm here for you. You're not alone." Ben looked up at Richard, his eyes filled with confusion. "But you're not my real dad," he said, his voice laced with sadness. "I don't even know you." The words hit Richard like a punch to the gut. He had spent weeks trying to build a connection with Ben, to prove to him that he was here for him. But hearing Ben's words made him realize just how far he still had to go. They weren't there yet. Richard wasn't Ben's real dad, not in the sense that Emily was his mother. He was still a stranger trying to fill shoes that were far too big for him. "Ben," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. "I may not be your real dad, but I promise you that I'm here. I'm going to be here for you, no matter what. We're going to figure this out together, okay?" Ben looked up at Richard, his eyes searching his face for any sign of truth. Richard knew that he had to be patient. This wasn't something that would happen overnight. Ben had been raised by Emily, and now Richard was entering their world. But he wasn't going anywhere. After a long pause, Ben finally nodded, though his sadness still lingered. "Okay," he whispered. Emily watched from the doorway, her heart heavy with emotion. She had always known that Richard would struggle with the idea of fatherhood. She had known that it would take time, patience, and understanding. But seeing Richard reach out to Ben in this moment, his first real step toward becoming a father, filled her with hope. Richard stood up, looking at Emily. "Can I take him to the park for a while?" he asked. "I think it would help." Emily hesitated, but then she saw the determination in Richard's eyes. He was serious. He wanted to make this work. "Of course," she said, her voice soft. "Just be gentle with him. He's been through a lot." Richard nodded, his heart full. "I will. I promise." The park was quiet, the evening air cool and crisp as Richard walked beside Ben, his hand resting gently on the boy's shoulder. Ben hadn't said much since they left the apartment, but he was no longer crying. The walk had a calming effect on both of them, and Richard felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. They reached the swings, and Ben hesitated for a moment before sitting down. Richard pushed him gently, just as he had done a few weeks earlier, but this time, there was something different in the air. The swing swayed back and forth, and Ben's eyes began to sparkle again, his small laughter filling the air. As Richard pushed him higher, he realized something. This wasn't going to be easy. He would never be able to replace the memories of Ben's real father or the years that Emily had spent raising him alone. But he could build new memories, create new moments with Ben, ones that were filled with love, patience, and understanding. And so, Richard continued to push Ben higher, not just on the swing but toward the life they could build together. He wasn't perfect. He knew that. But he was there, and he was willing to try every single day. As the sun set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Richard stood beside Ben, watching as the boy kicked his legs to go higher. Ben smiled up at him, and for the first time, Richard felt a sense of contentment, a sense of peace. This wasn't the future he had imagined for himself. But it was the future he had, and it was enough.